Good afternoon, grade 12. Today's video lesson, we're going to focus on the evaluation of the South African economic growth and development approaches. We are going to look at any positive outcomes and any negative outcomes. We will first look at the growth approaches and then the development approaches. We are on page 133 in the textbook. All right, where are they going to ask these questions? Okay, potentially data response questions and maybe discuss for 8, if that even. All right, so if we look at our economic growth approaches, on the positive side, the successes in terms of economic growth since 1994, we did say that in 1994, South Africa's economy was very isolated from the rest of the world. Because of apartheid, other countries showed their opposition with sanctions and boycotts. So we were not allowed really to export anything to other countries. We were not allowed to import stuff from other countries. So we were very much isolated in Africa. And obviously since 1994, with the advent of democracy, the economy started opening up again. And one of the goals was to have our economy become more integrated into the global markets. We wanted to become involved in the export markets again. All right, and one of the success things is that we have become a successful exporter of value-added goods and services. Just one thing, your value-added goods and services refers basically to agriculture and mining. Remember, we said that we are not going to export raw commodities. We are not going to export unprocessed raw materials. We first add value to our raw materials before we start exporting. All right, so we are exporting more value-added goods and services, not only commodities. All right, so on the positive side, public finances were stabilized. Okay, so the public debt to GDP ratio has decreased, which means obviously that the deficit on the budget was getting smaller. So it wasn't necessary for the government to borrow all that much. The public debt to GDP ratio is basically the percentage of public debt out of the GDP, and that has decreased. Inflation was also stabilized, and for the most part have been between the target of 3 and 6%. Our international reserves increased as a result, obviously, of international transactions and the foreign exchange that we earn from our exports, and the exchange rate has been relatively stable. Obviously, there has been times that there was big fluctuations, but if we look at it over a longer period of time, the general trend is relatively stable. All right, exchange controls were relaxed. We mentioned that previously as well, but the rand has weakened against the dollar since 2005, obviously due to many factors. Yes, there was the worldwide recession, but many other factors as well. Obviously, our junk status doesn't help. All right, so the rand, if we compare it to what it was in 2005 compared to what it was in 1994, the rand has weakened. It's a depreciated rand, but remember, we did say that in order to make our industries more competitive, we do need the rand to be slightly weaker. So it's not altogether a bad thing. Infrastructure development has also produced growth in growth fixed capital formation. Okay, because in each of those strategies, if you remember, a focus area of each of those strategies was infrastructure development. So it has led to a lot of investment. Gross fixed capital formation is investment. The government has invested a large amount of money in terms of infrastructure development. And then the last point there, South Africa ranks 75th on the Index of Economic Freedom, and our overall score is higher than the world average. So we're nowhere near the top, but at least it is higher than the world average. On the negative side, okay, the economy is unable to generate enough employment. As I said previously, none of the strategies was extremely successful in terms of job creation. Some jobs were created, some jobs were lost, all right, but we haven't really been able to address the unemployment issue, which obviously results in poverty carrying on. We never solved the poverty issue. People that don't find employment obviously don't have an income, and they will be living in poverty. We cannot decrease poverty without decreasing unemployment first. All right, so poverty levels are still extremely high, and there's still very high levels of inequality as well. All right, economy has grown consistently but the growth rates have been below the growth rates experienced by other emerging economies. Sometimes, obviously, we've had positive growth, which is a good thing, but there has been times just recently again where we have actually had a decrease in the GDP, so a negative economic growth, which means that the economy basically is shrinking. But if we compare our growth rate with the growth rate experienced by other emerging economies like China, for example, China and India, Brazil, their growth rates have been much higher than ours. So other developing countries obviously are more successful in terms of creating economic growth. Our growth rates are single digits. It's never even reached 5%, whereas China, for example, had double-digit growth rates, more than 10% economic growth, not at the moment, but in the recent past. All right, so obviously we are not reaching our targets in terms of growth rates. Now we're aiming for 5 to 6% economic growth at least, and we have not reached that target. Then skills development as a whole has also not achieved its aims because the economy, we are still constrained by a lack of skills. Now there's a lot of people that still cannot find employment because they do not have the skills necessary to enter the labor market successfully. So the whole skills development system, the whole skills development levy, the SETAs, they have goals, but they are not making a difference. People are receiving training, for example, people that write the trade tests. Once you exercise a trade, when you want to become an electrician or a plumber or a mechanic, you have to write a trade test at the end of your skills training. And we actually find that the number of people that pass their trade tests is actually getting less and less and less. So training is being provided, but we cannot really say that the training has been extremely successful. All right, now initially the SETAs and skills development fell under the auspices of the Labor Department. It was seen as a labor issue. Just recently it was moved so that the Department of Higher Education could monitor the skills training at the workplace, hoping that maybe if the focus is more on education, and because the Department of Education will know what to look for and where to concentrate on, they're hoping that it would improve. All right, but when it was under the Labor Department, it wasn't very successful. All right, and then as I mentioned, jobs have been created in some sectors, but jobs have also been lost in other sectors. So unemployment as a whole is increasing still. It's really a very high unemployment rate. And as I said, if people don't have jobs, obviously then they will not decrease poverty at all. And then lastly, we struggle to attract FDIs. Okay, remember FDIs, foreign direct investments. We are struggling to attract the FDIs. We are not a prime investment kind of destination. Other countries, foreigners do not want to invest in our country. And a big problem there is that the wage levels relative to productivity is higher. All right, so we are giving wage increases. People are earning high wages without actually increasing their productivity, which creates inflation potentially. All right. Obviously, our junk status and our investment status have been downgraded now recently. That also makes it very difficult for us to attract FDIs in other countries, developed countries specifically. They are not really allowed to invest in countries that have a substandard investment rating, which we do at this stage. All right, so obviously we need to improve that. And the reason for the junk, well, bordering on junk status is obviously the trust in government. They don't trust that the government can meet its obligations. They don't think that those investment agencies, they just don't think that the government is able to cover its debts. They don't have trust in the government to be able to recover all the money that they have borrowed. Okay, if we look at the evaluation of economic development approaches, okay, in terms of economic development, remember in terms of economic growth, we focus on production, economic indicators, employment, unemployment, productivity, inflation, GDP growth, all of those things relates to economic growth. But when we look at economic development, the focus is more on the quality of life of people. So on the positive side, millions of people, their standards of living have been improved because they were given access of housing, whether it's an RDP house or whether houses was financed through the subsidy system of the government. More people now have access to basic services like clean water, like sanitation, like garbage removal. Okay, the government has done a lot to create more of a gender equity so that there's no discrimination against women and women are no longer marginalized. primary health care is provided for people that do not have medical aids on their own, and also a lot of land reform has taken place. Okay, there's been a lot of efforts in these fields. Social grants have been expanded. There's more than 15 million people that are currently receiving a social grant. Okay, so that the network of social grants have been expanded. The amount of people receiving it is more. Then we've also mentioned before that every single household is receiving 6,000 of clean liters of water for free that they do not pay for, as well as 50 kilowatts of free electricity every month. The first 6,000 liters that we use of the water we don't pay for, and the first 50 kilowatts of electricity we don't pay for. After that, obviously, the more you use, the more you're going to pay. Then they've also tried to achieve economic equity through redistribution, obviously through a progressive tax system, new wealth taxes that have been introduced, where literally it can increase the government's tax revenue so that they have more money available to relieve poverty in lower income groups. Also, BEE and triple BEE employment equity obviously gives preference to previously disadvantaged workers. They have opportunities now that they wouldn't have had in the past. Okay, and then we can also see that the number of people living in poverty has declined, but we still have a very high number. Okay, the rate of decline, the percentage by which it is declining is very, very low. So poverty is not increasing per se. I wouldn't say right now with COVID, I think it is actually getting worse. But over the general trend over a longer period of time is that it is declining, but at a very, very slow rate. We still have a large amount of people. The stats actually show that more than 50%, more than half of the population of South Africa is actually living in poverty, which is really bad. All right. And then the total BEE transactions have increased. Now, that is a success factor in terms of creating equity. On the negative side, we know that we have a very high level of youth unemployment, and that creates a very high dependency rate. Remember, your dependency rate is the percentage of people that are between the ages of 16 and 65 that should be economically active, but they are not economically active. So they're not, in other words, not earning a salary, they're not having a job, so they're not contributing to the income of a household. The dependency rate is the amount of people that are supposed to be economically active but is not, either because they cannot get a job or whatever, that obviously rely then on other people to provide for them. All right, as I said when we did chapter 11, your dependency rate, you are all of you matric learners are part of the dependency rate because you are between the ages of 16 and 65. You are mentally and physically able to work, but you are not yet working because obviously you are first finishing your school education and then your studies after that. So in the meantime, your parents or guardians are earning salaries and you are dependent on them to provide for you. All right, now obviously when there's high levels of youth unemployment, when people that have left school, people that have just finished their university degrees, if they are not able to find a job, obviously they will be dependent on other adults to provide for them until such a time that they can actually earn a living. All right. So we know that we have high levels of youth unemployment. We know that it's very difficult for new entrants into the job market to actually find a job. All right, then we have a high infant mortality rate and a low life expectancy at birth. Okay, just to recap, your infant mortality rate is the number of babies that was born alive but die before their first birthday. All right, and generally the reason it's not normal for babies to die before they turn 1. The general reason for this is obviously malnutrition, okay, where babies are not fed properly. There is no money, they cannot look after them properly. So malnutrition, the babies do not get fed nicely, they get sick and whatever. All right, and then obviously they don't have access to healthcare because people are living in poverty, and then they die before they reach the age of 1. Okay, life expectancy at birth, we said that is the expected number of years that a person is expected to live based on the conditions that he's born in, the situation in the country. If there's high levels of poverty, if there's certain diseases that are prevalent, that will bring down the life expectancy at birth. Now, if we compare our infant mortality rates, it is extremely high, even if we look at other developing countries. Our infant mortality is much higher than what it should be. and the life expectancy at birth is too low. People die, or the average is very low, because many people die at a very young age. As I said in class, some babies are born HIV positive, so they don't grow very old, and the more people die at a young age, the lower that average is going to become. So then the life expectancy is very low. And again, our life expectancy at birth is low, even if we compare it with developing countries, because of poverty and unhealthy living conditions and people not having access to healthcare, etc., etc. All right, then we rank very low in terms of certain social indicators. As I said, life expectancy at birth, it's too low. Our infant mortality is too high. And then education has increased in terms of access. So more people have access to education. Everybody technically have access to education, but it has not necessarily increased in terms of quality. All right, if you look at the matric pass rate, for example, the matric pass rate has been increasing. We'll see what happens this year. Okay, but it has been increasing, but the number of people that pass with university exemption is not necessarily increasing. That would be an indication of quality education when you are able to pass with university exemption, for example. Okay, and then lastly, there's a high level of income inequality still. Okay, what we can see is that the disparity between different population groups are getting smaller. Okay, so that's where we see that BEE and affirmative action and employment equity is having some success, because the differences in wealth and income distribution between the different racial groupings is getting smaller. But when we look at the distribution of income within one population group, there's actually an increase in inequality. All right, so basically the difference in income between white people and black people is getting smaller, but there's like the inequality between, if we just look at black people in the country, rich black people are getting richer and poor black people is getting poorer. So the differences within a specific race group, the inequality is actually getting worse, which shows that yes, BEE is working, affirmative action is working, employment equity is working, but it's only working for some people. Some people are benefiting from it, but there are large amounts of people that still don't see the benefits of those policies.